The first time I didn't explain myself, it didn't feel like a brave decision. It didn't arrive with clarity or confidence. There was no inner speech preparing me for impact, no sense of empowerment waiting on the other side. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, in the space where I usually rush to speak. A pause appeared, small, fragile, and instead of filling it, I stayed inside it. That alone felt unfamiliar, like standing still on a moving staircase. For most of my life, explaining myself had been instinctive. If someone misunderstood me, I clarified. If someone questioned my intentions, I adjusted my words. If silence lingered too long, I stepped in to soften it, shape it, make it easier to carry. Explaining wasn't something I questioned. It was something I relied on. It felt safer to translate myself than to risk being misread. Over time, that habit became so natural that I stopped noticing how much energy it required. That day, however, something subtle had shifted inside me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I was simply tired. Not the kind of tired that asks for rest, but the kind that comes from repeating the same emotional motion for years. Tired of shrinking complex feelings into neat explanations. Tired of offering clarity before anyone had even asked for it. Tired of making sure everyone else felt comfortable with what I was feeling. The question came the way it always did. Casual. Familiar. The kind of question that assumes you'll fill in the blanks, that expects context, that treats silence as unfinished. I felt the reflex rise immediately. That old impulse to clarify, to justify, to make myself easier to understand. My body knew the sequence by heart, but this time I noticed it, and instead of following it, I let it pass. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It wasn't calm or empowering. It was heavy, exposed, and strangely honest. In that moment, I realized that explaining myself had never been only about communication. It had been a way of managing other people's expectations, a way of controlling how much of me they had to confront. By not explaining, I removed that control, and with it, the familiar sense of safety. I didn't yet realize who would feel that shift the most. I only knew that silence doesn't comfort, and it doesn't negotiate. It reveals, and once it does, nothing stays exactly the same. After that moment, I expected consequences to arrive quickly. A reaction. A confrontation. Something that would confirm I had crossed an invisible line. Instead, nothing happened right away. The world didn't correct me. The conversation didn't collapse. And that absence of immediate response unsettled me more than resistance ever had. I had spent so long explaining myself to manage outcomes that not managing them felt like stepping into open space without knowing where I would land. As the hours passed, I became aware of how often I had used explanations as a form of emotional insurance. If I clarified everything in advance, I could prevent disappointment. If I offered reasons before they were requested, I could stay ahead of misunderstanding. Silence had always felt risky because it removed that protection. Without explanations, I couldn't steer perception. I couldn't soften reactions. I had to let other people experience me without instructions. That realization brought discomfort, not because I feared being misunderstood, but because I feared what might surface without my constant mediation. Explaining myself had allowed me to remain involved while staying hidden at the same time. I could be present without being fully exposed. Silence stripped that layer away. It asked me to stand still inside my own truth and see who noticed, and who didn't. I started replaying past moments in my mind, noticing how often I had spoken not to express myself, but to relieve tension. How many times I had overexplained simply because I sensed distance and wanted to close it quickly. How often my words had arrived not from clarity, but from anxiety. Seeing that pattern so clearly made it impossible to ignore how deeply it had shaped my relationships, and how invisible it had felt while I was inside it. What unsettled me most was the quiet question that followed. If I stopped explaining myself, What would remain between me and the people I cared about? Would they lean in, or would they step back? I didn't know the answer yet. All I knew was that something had already changed, not externally, but internally. And that internal shift was beginning to influence everything else, whether I was ready for it or not. In the days that followed, I began to notice how deeply explaining myself had been woven into my daily interactions. It wasn't just something I did in moments of conflict. It was present in small exchanges, casual conversations, even in silence shared with people I knew well. I had learned to anticipate confusion before it happened and correct it preemptively. Without realizing it, I had been narrating my existence as if clarity were a prerequisite for belonging. Choosing not to explain myself again felt unnatural at first. My body reacted before my mind could intervene. I felt the familiar impulse rise, the tightening in my chest, the readiness to speak, the urge to smooth the moment before it could become uncomfortable. Each time I resisted that impulse, there was a brief internal panic, followed by a strange sense of stillness. The absence of explanation created space I didn't know how to fill. And for once, I didn't try. That space felt exposed. Without words to manage perception, I became more aware of how people responded when they had to interpret me on their own. Some leaned closer, paying more attention to tone, posture, and presence. Others seemed uncertain, as if waiting for the cues I used to provide. That hesitation revealed something important. My explanations had been doing more work than I realized. I began to see how often my words had protected others from having to engage deeply. When everything was clarified, there was no need for curiosity, no reason to ask questions, no invitation to sit with ambiguity. Silence removed that convenience. It shifted responsibility, not dramatically but unmistakably, back to the other person. There were moments when the quiet felt uncomfortable enough that I almost broke it. In those moments, I had to confront an old fear, that without explanation, I might be misjudged. That people might fill the gaps with assumptions I couldn't control. Sitting with that fear was difficult, but it was also revealing. It showed me how much energy I had been spending trying to manage outcomes that were never fully mine to control. As time passed, patterns started to emerge. Certain relationships adjusted almost immediately. Conversations slowed, but they became more deliberate. Attention, when it arrived, felt less automatic and more intentional. It wasn't constant, but it carried weight. Other relationships, however, felt strained by the absence of my usual effort. The silence lingered, unanswered, unacknowledged. Instead of rushing to interpret those moments, I stayed with them. I resisted the urge to rescue the interaction with words. That restraint was new. It required trust, not in the outcome, but in myself. Trust that I could tolerate not knowing what someone thought of me in that moment. Trust that my presence didn't need to be explained to be valid. I noticed how my internal dialogue began to change as well. Without the constant preparation to speak, my thoughts slowed. I listened more carefully, not just to others, but to myself. I became aware of how often I had equated being understood with being safe. Letting go of that belief felt destabilizing at first, but it also felt honest. There was no dramatic shift in how people treated me. No sudden revelations or confessions. What changed was subtler. The dynamic itself felt different, less managed, less predictable. Silence, when it appeared, no longer felt like a problem to solve. It felt like information. By the end of that phase, one truth had become clear. Not explaining myself wasn't about withholding or withdrawing. It was about allowing reality to reveal itself without interference. And once I stopped stepping in to control the narrative, I began to see my relationships, and myself, with a clarity that explanation had never allowed. At some point, I realized the change was no longer confined to my inner world. It had begun to register outside of me, quietly but unmistakably. The absence of my usual explanations altered the atmosphere in subtle ways. Conversations felt less guided. Pauses lingered longer. And in those pauses, something unfamiliar surfaced, a sense of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. I noticed how often people seemed to wait for me. Not overtly, not impatiently, but with a quiet expectation. They glanced in my direction during moments of silence, as if anticipating the version of me who would normally step in to clarify, soften, or redirect. When that version didn't appear, the dynamic shifted. The room felt less choreographed, more exposed. That exposure created tension, though not the kind that demanded resolution. It was a low, steady awareness that something had changed. Without my explanations acting as a bridge, others had to decide whether to cross the gap themselves. Some did. They asked questions. They paid closer attention. They adjusted their presence in response to mine. Others didn't. The silence stretched, and instead of being filled, it remained. Those moments were revealing in their own way. They showed me how much my previous effort had been holding things together. Without it, certain connections felt thinner, less responsive. That realization was uncomfortable, but it was also honest. I became aware of how often my explanations had served as an emotional cushion for others. By clarifying everything, I had spared them the effort of interpretation. Silence removed that cushion. It required attentiveness. It required curiosity. And not everyone was willing to offer that. There were moments when I felt the old urge rise again, the desire to repair the discomfort, to restore familiarity. In those moments, I had to remind myself that clarity earned through effort wasn't the same as clarity freely given. Holding my silence wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of trust. I noticed how my own presence began to change in response. I stood more firmly in conversations. I listened without leaning forward. I allowed pauses to exist without labeling them as failures. That steadiness didn't go unnoticed. It subtly redefined how others engaged with me. In some interactions, attention arrived differently, slower, more deliberate. It wasn't prompted by explanation or reassurance. It came from observation, from people noticing what I wasn't saying as much as what I was. Those moments felt grounded, as if they were meeting me where I actually stood. At the same time, there were interactions where nothing changed at all. Silence was met with distance, not curiosity. Instead of rushing to interpret that as rejection, I allowed it to inform me. It showed me which connections depended on my constant effort, and which didn't. What struck me most was how little I needed to do for these patterns to reveal themselves. I wasn't confronting anyone. I wasn't withdrawing. I was simply no longer managing the emotional flow. And in that absence of control, reality had room to show itself. By then, it was clear that silence wasn't neutral. It rearranged the balance of attention. It exposed the dynamics that explanation had been smoothing over for years. And once those dynamics were visible, there was no unseeing them. As time went on, the absence of explanation stopped feeling like a temporary experiment and began to feel like a new internal posture. I wasn't constantly monitoring my silence anymore. I wasn't waiting to see if it would work. It simply became the way I showed up. That steadiness surprised me. What once felt risky now felt natural, almost grounding. I noticed how my body responded differently in conversations. My shoulders stayed relaxed. My breathing remained steady. I wasn't bracing myself for moments of misunderstanding or scrambling to correct them. Without the pressure to clarify everything, my presence felt less fragmented. I was no longer split between being there and managing how I was being perceived. Some connections adjusted in subtle but meaningful ways. Without my explanation smoothing every interaction, attention began to arrive more intentionally. It didn't rush in. It wasn't constant. But when it showed up, it felt earned in a different sense, not through effort, but through mutual awareness. Those moments felt quieter, yet more solid. Other connections, however, became noticeably thinner. Silence lingered, unanswered. Conversations felt distant, less responsive. In the past, I would have interpreted that as a signal to try harder, to explain more, to restore closeness. This time I didn't. I let the distance exist without immediately filling it. That choice revealed more than any conversation could have. At first, allowing that distance felt like a loss. There was a temptation to see it as failure, as if not explaining myself meant I was giving something up. But slowly, I realized it wasn't loss. It was information. It showed me which relationships relied on my constant effort to stay alive, and which ones could breathe on their own. I also began to notice how differently I related to myself. Without the habit of constant self-justification, my inner dialogue softened. I wasn't rehearsing conversations that hadn't happened yet. I wasn't preparing defenses in advance. My thoughts slowed, and in that slowness, I felt more present in my own life. There was a quiet confidence growing beneath the surface. Not the kind that demands recognition or validation, but the kind that remains steady, whether it is noticed or not. I wasn't withholding myself. I wasn't testing anyone. I was simply allowing my presence to be enough without explanation. Moments of silence no longer felt like gaps to be filled. They felt like boundaries, gentle but firm. They protected my energy instead of draining it. And for the first time, I understood that clarity doesn't always come from saying more. Sometimes it comes from staying still and allowing things to reveal themselves. What surprised me most was how little I missed the old pattern. The constant explaining, the emotional labor, the quiet anxiety of being misunderstood. Once those habits loosened their grip, I didn't feel emptier. I felt more intact, as if parts of myself that had been scattered were finally returning. By the end of that phase, one truth stood clearly. Not explaining myself hadn't made me distant or cold. It had made me honest, with others, and with myself. And from that honesty, a different kind of connection became possible. One that didn't depend on constant effort, but on presence freely given and freely received. If you're still here, listening to the end of this story, I want to thank you for staying. Not because you needed an explanation, but because you allowed yourself to sit with the silence it left behind. Stories like this aren't meant to rush you toward answers. They exist to create a pause, a moment where you can notice what resonates, what stirs, and what quietly asks to be reconsidered inside you. Maybe you recognized yourself somewhere along the way, in the habit of explaining too much, in the fear of being misunderstood, in the exhaustion that comes from managing how you're perceived instead of simply being present. If so, let this be a gentle reminder. You don't owe clarity to everyone. You don't have to translate every feeling to make it valid. Silence, when chosen consciously, isn't withdrawal. It's honesty. And honesty has a way of rearranging things without force. This story doesn't end here, because neither does the process it describes. The shift that begins with one quiet moment continues in many small ways, in future conversations, in pauses you no longer rush to fill, in the space you allow yourself to occupy without explanation. If you choose to come back, another story will be waiting. Another moment to listen, to reflect, and to sit with what isn't said, yet still deeply felt. Thank you for being here.